started, as I was saying before, I started writing, I grew up in New Jersey and went to public schools there, and then my family moved to England when I was about 10 years old. And I went to a private school there where we did things like creative writing. And so that's really when, and I guess we were encouraged to be creative in this way that was new to me and different. And so I started writing at a very early age. And I think for me, it was at the same time that I started writing was the same time I started reading books and sort of falling in love with reading books. And so for me, writing and reading have always been very connected. And I feel like my writing life and my reading life are very much, they both are very essential to me. But then when I went, and I continued writing through secondary school, then when I went to college, I studied English literature and writing again. And I started out actually being more interested in poetry and thinking that I wanted to be a poet and writing mostly poems. And then I started writing short stories, and something changed, and I think I realized that I could, when I was writing short stories or writing prose, I could do everything I was doing when I was writing poetry in terms of thinking a lot about language and images and words, but do something more. I could also tell a story, and I guess it just was a more natural form for me. I felt like I could express more of myself in short stories than I could in poems, so I sort of started then concentrating in writing fiction. And then as a young writer, I started out writing mostly just short stories, and the two short stories that I sent you that you read are both stories that I wrote when I was in my 20s in the 1980s, so they're very old. They're very much stories that I wrote when I was a young writer. And then this book, it's interesting that I came back to that same sort of voice of a young narrator to write this novel when I was much older, when I think I was 45 when I wrote this book. And I think it was interesting to me because when I was writing those stories with young narrators, I sort of felt like I finished that part of my journey as a writer. And as I got older, I started writing more about adults and books about people who were older and had different problems. But it always sort of, I was always very aware that I had never written a novel from that point of view, from that adolescent point of view. And I think it took me 20 years, a long time, to be able to write a novel from an adolescent point of view. And I think that's because, I guess when I write a novel, when I write anything, I like to write about not about myself, but to invent a character. And I think it took me that long to sort of distance myself from my own adolescence so that I could create another adolescent character who I share things with, who's similar to me, but I felt he was very different. He grew up in New York City, and I did not, and his parents were divorced, and my parents. So there were all these differences between us, and I was, of course, he's 18, and I was then in my early 40s, so I felt that I had enough distance from that sort of character to then devote a whole novel to the character. And so that's how then this book came to be published. And it was interesting, when I wrote this book, I thought I was writing, like all my books, I thought I was writing a book for adult readers that younger readers would also read and enjoy because of the age of the narrator. And then when it was published in the United States, they decided to publish it as a book specifically for what they call young adults, for younger readers. And so they marketed it in a different way. In the bookstore, it goes to the children's book section and not the adult section. And I wasn't happy about that because I felt it really was a book for adults, and that I knew from my own experience that young readers who like to read fine books that are, you don't want to be reading books for children when you're the age that you are. You want to be reading books that are for adults. And so I knew it seemed to me like not a good idea, but it's just the way that they market books in the United States in this very sort of particular way. And so the book was published as a young adult novel, and it was interesting how then sometimes just how, I don't know, it's interesting to me sort of how books then, the publisher can decide what their identity is, but then the book can take on another identity by different readers finding the book and talking about the book, and newspapers then reviewing the book. Some reviewed it as if it was a book for children, and some, reviewed it as if it was a book for adults. And so it's an odd book of my books because it has this very sort of schizophrenic personality. So
why did you decide to send us the stories you did send?
I guess because I was aware that you had read this book, and in my mind, those early stories of mine are very connected with this book because they're the same sort of young adolescent. I guess in all cases it's a boy, although I have written stories from a female point of view too. But in this case, they were all boys. I don't know. It's interesting. It didn't occur to me that maybe I should send something very different.
I didn't mean to say that.
No, but it's because and I guess it was interesting to me sort of that. Also, those stories are set in the 1980s, and this book is set very specifically. It's in 2003, and so I thought it was sort of interesting how the lives of teenagers change according to the era in which we're living, but then there are other things, feelings, I feel like, that do not change, that everybody sort of experiences no matter when they're growing up or where they're growing up. And that's what I think allowed me to write a book about adolescence when I was very close to being an adolescent, when I was in my 20s, and then to do it again when I was in my 40s, because I feel like once you have that experience, you never forget it, sort of. And it doesn't. There are things about it that don't change. I was very aware that James was living in a very different world than I was living in. Even I was in New York City when I was writing the book, so and I live in the village, and James lives in the village. So I was aware that there was sort of this character was living alongside of me, but that I was very aware that it was a character and that he had a very different life than mine, even though they sometimes overlapped.
Are there any questions to start with?
A few days ago, we watched the movie adaptation of the book, and I wanted to know what did you thought of how it was translated from like book form to the movie. Did you like it? Did you like the actors? How it was made?
First of all, what did you think of the?
Yes, but of course I prefer the book. I wanted to know what you thought.
Right. That was an interesting experience because the book was published actually in Italy before it was published in the United States. And this Roberto Faenza, who's an Italian film director, found the book and wanted very much to make this movie of it. And I met with him and I talked to him about the book, and I liked him, and he seemed to really understand the book and to like the character. And I was a little concerned because I felt the book is so much about New York City, and I was worried that an Italian director wouldn't sort of understand the New York City of the book. But he assured me that he did, that he had lived in New York City and sort of understood New York City. So and the other reason why I decided to let him do it was he wanted me to write the screenplay. So I thought, well, that's good. It's an opportunity for me to try and create the movie in the way that I would like it to be made. So I started working with him, and then as I was working with him on the screenplay, I realized that he had very different ideas about the book and a very different conception of the characters and the world of the book. And so I just decided to stop working on it, to let him make the movie he wanted, because it's his movie, it's not my movie, it's my book. So I decided for them not to use my name on the screenplay because I didn't like how the screenplay was evolving. And there are, I don't like the movie. I'm disappointed in the movie because I feel that there's a way that he perceives the characters, I feel, that's very different from the way that I do. It's interesting, just for example, the character of the therapist, the psychiatrist. In the book, it was very important to me that she be a real doctor, that she's somebody who's a serious person, and in the book, actually, James makes fun of people who are like therapists, interesting that Roberto Faenza wanted her not to be a psychiatrist, but to be sort of this kooky life therapist who was going to run with James and do these things that I felt like were inappropriate. And the other thing that where I realized we were really differing was the conception of the grandmother. I wanted the grandmother to be somebody, I felt like she was somebody who was, I don't know, was sort of an elegant person and very had a lot of sophistication, and he saw her much more as a sentimental, I think, grandmother who was much more casual, and Ellen Burstyn, who was the actress, decided to play her in a way. So it's just a lot of little things like that, where the characters don't seem like my characters, and it not, it didn't surprise me, because I'm always, when somebody takes something that you've done and they make something else, of course it's going to be different from and that's why I write books and I don't make movies, because I like what I do with the book.
You know why? I mean, this character skipped a generation, that is his parents,
Right.
and he built a very, very good relationship with someone who had been young in the 60s or the 70s. Those movements, I mean, hippies and more natural life at that time.
I think that, maybe that's an aspect of the book that in some way reflects my own life, where I had a very close relationship with my grandmother. But I think my experience is that people often have a different kind of relationship with their grandparents than they do with their parents, because your parents are concerned about you and invested in your life in a way that's much more, I guess, much more intense than, whereas a grandparent, I feel like, they're not being a parent, they've already been a parent, and so they can love you and sort of interact with you in a much more relaxed and less stressful way. And so I think the relationship between parents and grandparents can be, I think it's just very different from relationships between parents. And I think both are good and both help people form themselves. But I think that relationship is sort of a real gift in life, that you can have somebody who loves you and is looking out for you, but isn't as invested in you doing the right thing or in succeeding, or they can be a little more, I think, supportive and comforting. So they come to me through first thinking about characters, and I think about the characters, and then I think about their relationships to one another. And then really whatever happens in a book arises out of that. I start having the characters talk to each other and interact, and then sort of see what happens. And I always know that a book is starting to work, that it's starting to come to life when the characters start doing things that I haven't predicted or that I haven't planned. And that either can arise, just you're writing dialogue and suddenly a character says something that you weren't planning for them to say, or something happens, they do something, and that's always a great, I'm always very relieved when that happens, because it's sort of, as an author, I feel like I can stop trying to coerce the characters and to make them do things and let them sort of decide what they're going to do. And in this book, it was sort of like I had ideas about what I thought James was going to do and where the story was going to go and how I wanted it to evolve. And then as I was writing the book, I realized he took on a life of his own, and sort of things that I thought were going to happen, suddenly they became, I realized that they were not going to happen, because he was doing something else or wanted to do something else, or it just felt more natural for him to be doing other things. And I guess with my characters too, and it's a little trickier in a book like this where it's written in first person, so you're seeing all these characters through James's perspective. Whereas in a book, if I was writing from third person, as the reader, you see each character, through the eyes of the author, so you have a more objective view of all the characters. And so in this book, it's a little tricky, because I wanted you to see, for instance, the parents. Of course, you're seeing them through James's eyes, but I also, I wanted you to get a sense of who the parents were outside of their relationship with James. I didn't want them, because I felt like he's very critical, he's very harsh, judging his parents, and I didn't want them to come across as being one-dimensional or sort of like these really bad parents. I wanted you to feel like they were perhaps making mistakes, but they were also trying to help their son and to do the right thing. And even though he wasn't appreciating it, they were making an effort.
That's exactly what I felt when I saw the movie, because I think all the characters were like placed in only one direction, and they were taken apart from that ambiguity or that subjectivity, because when you take away the person's point of view, it's like you just let it there.
Right. Yeah. No, it's interesting because I think in movies, if you have, and of course it all depends on the actor, sort of what the actors bring to the role. And I felt the one thing that I did like about the film, the smartest thing the director did was he hired a casting agent in New York City to cast the film. And so the parents, Marcia Gay Harden and Peter Gallagher, are two, I think, smart actors who I think understood those characters. But I felt like they were directed in a way that was, I think, as you're saying, very simplistic and sort of reductive. And unfortunately, they weren't able to give as interesting a performance as I think they might have with another director. Just too bad.
Was it difficult for you to, to think about adolescence nowadays? I believe that there are many aspects that
Right,
are
yeah.
changed.
Yes, of course, yeah. I guess, when I was working on this book, I kept doubting myself and thinking, I can't write this book now, I'm too far away from being an adolescent, and I'm gonna get things wrong. I don't know a lot about, for instance, I don't know a lot about popular music or things like that. And exactly, yeah. I mean, I don't interact with the world in the same way that James does, right. And I guess I just realized with any time you write fiction that's not about yourself and you're creating a character, you're making this extraordinary leap outside of yourself into somebody that you're inventing and creating. And I guess as an author, you just have to let yourself do that and not doubt yourself and not censor yourself. And because I feel like if you start doing that, if you start thinking, well, I really don't know, but then like I don't know what it is to be a grandmother, I don't know what it's like to be Jillian, I don't know really, and so it's all just what I'm imagining, and I feel like you just have to accept that and then let the reader judge whether James seems to be an authentic character or not, because that's what matters, is really what the reader's perception of him is and whether he seems real or not. And also I guess I felt like I cheated a little bit in this book, because I gave James a lot of, James isn't very interested in popular music, and so I sort of made things easy for myself by giving him a lot of passions that were my own, and made him sort of not be very reflective of contemporary culture.
You mean Denton Welch?
Yes, exactly.
I
Yeah.
have read Denton Welch.
Right. So, yeah. So I wasn't, he wasn't identifying with things that were around him in the culture. He was more looking back in a way. Yeah.
He's also a kind of odd in a teenage world. It's like he doesn't feel like a normal teenager. He wants to be an adult and be by himself.
Right. No, and I guess, one of the reasons why I did that was, I think, for me, very much being an adolescent, or actually being an adult, I feel the same thing, but often you feel very alone, and you feel very estranged from other people. And so I felt by giving him these passions and interests that did not coincide with his peers, with other people, it sort of was a way of illustrating how different he felt and how alone he felt, that he didn't share a lot of the same interests, or as he was interested in people like Denton Welch, who, he couldn't talk to his friends about Denton Welch and stuff like that, yeah.
I have a doubt about the book that is the Socrates perception, the Age of Innocence. Have you read that book?
I have, yes.
Yes, how would you? I saw a part of the movie of the Martin Scorsese film.
Yes.
And I didn't like it very much because it was kind of maybe a backwards experience to maybe a very bad excessive historical content. I mean, like the novel was wrote in 1920s, and it goes 50 years backwards to reflect another kind of historical experience.
Right.
So how, do you think it's a, and it was a bestseller too, so
Right.
how do you, what is your relation with that novel? If you look it as it was a great novel,
Right.
maybe it's because the psychiatrist is not in the eyes of the character a nice, a good person, or maybe she's the kind of, I know that she looks very much into him, into his personality, and maybe that isn't comforting to the character.
I don't know. I mean, it's been a long time since I read The Age of Innocence, but I like Edith Wharton, and I like her books because I like the things that she's concerned with, the sort of, and again, it's sort of the same as me, where I'm interested in the relationships between people. And it's interesting to me thinking about that book because you're right, it was written after, you know, but when you read it, I don't think you have that sense, and that's interesting because this book, you know, I was writing this book in the summer of 2003 when it's set, so I was very trying to make it reflect contemporary life or what was going on. But then I think the interesting thing is once a book goes out in the world and once a few years pass, people lose sense of when books are written and when they're set and things like that. And so a book like The Age of Innocence, I read that, I'm not aware of that distance between the time it's taking place and the time it was created. And then of course another 70 years have passed since it was written, or even longer.
The movie of this director maybe reflects a lot because of the images, the characters.
Right.
I had a sensation it was really similar to the player from Dostoevsky, where the lady of the coach seems pretty similar in both cases. And I mean that in both novels you can maybe make a relation, or maybe take distance from the movie and the novel. Maybe when there's images in it, or maybe if you see a movie, it's very different to the novel you release.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me being a novelist and thinking about movies is, and one of the reasons why I enjoy being a novelist is because I feel like when I'm writing a novel, I feel like I do everything. I'm the director, I decide how, and I'm also the costume designer, and I design the sets, you know, and if I want it to rain, it can rain. If I want 1,000 people in a scene, I can have 1,000 people. Whereas in a movie with a director, so much of it is trying to get what you want and depending on other people, or not doing things because it's impossible. And I know, I mean, it sort of amazes me that movies get made because it's so much work and it's so difficult to read, you know, to make films. But and it's also so expensive. You know, you need $8 million to make a movie, whereas to write a novel, I don't need any money starting out. But it just, I like the freedom that I have as a novelist, where I can make all the decisions and I can do whatever I want. Whereas I feel like to make a movie, it's much more collaborative and it's much more, you have to keep making compromises, I feel.
Here.
Yes.
Did you think another title for your book, or how it came into your head, that title of text from a book?
Yeah. This book, there were two interesting things about this book, and one was the way the idea of the book came to me was I had finished a book and published a book, and I had not started a new book, and I was getting worried and anxious because I wasn't writing, and usually I just wait for an idea to come to me sort of through my subconscious, and that sort of wasn't happening. So I decided that I wouldn't think about writing a book, I would just think about writing one sentence. And I just thought of this sentence, which is the first sentence of this book about Jillian pronouncing her name and the mother coming back from the honeymoon. And when I wrote that sentence, I didn't know who Jillian was.
Title for your book?
Oh, I will go right, then the title of the book. So in the book, originally, the title was But I Won't, because in the first draft of the book, James had gone, he'd been sent to a sailing camp, and the motto of the sailing camp was, I can do it. And James, they had t-shirts that said, I can do it, but James had written, but I won't, underneath. And so, so the title of the book was going to be, But I Won't, or I Can Do It, But I Won't. But then there's this book, a very well-known book by this author, Judy Blume, that's a very popular book in the United States. I don't know, but it's
kind of sorry.
okay, it's called But Then Again, Maybe I Won't, or something. But it had a very similar title, so the publisher told me you can't use that title because it's too similar. So then I thought, well, so then I thought of lots of different titles for the book, which could be all these different things. But then I had this idea that, well, maybe I could change the motto of the sailing camp and still work with that idea. And so I found this quote from Ovid, which is, be patient and tough, someday this pain will be useful to you, which I thought could work as the motto, and then it could also work with the book. So, so actually, it's interesting, some of my books, I come up with the title very easily, and it stays through the whole course of the book, and other times, it's a real, it's very difficult to find the right title, or it keeps changing as I work on the book. So. And then other people told me, oh, that's a terrible title, someday this pain will be useful to you, it's too long, and nobody will remember it. And publishers like titles that are very short because they want somebody to say, I read this good book and I liked it, and it's called, you know, something very concise, so that somebody can go to a bookstore and say, I want this book, whereas they were worried that people would say, I heard about this book, but I forgot what the title is.
Is this something that represents a kind of rite of passage, that is a lesson you learn through life? Or is there any touch of irony there? You find this kind of detachment that adults have as regards the pain that adolescents suffer?
Yeah, we talked about pain when we were thinking about the title. We thought that pain that referred to maybe like the pain that adolescent implies,
Right.
or maybe something that had to. Well, the quote is from a book about love and right.
Yes.
And that it's not love like. So we started thinking about the way that relationships nowadays, like in the love sense,
Right.
are changing, and we want to maybe that pain, that like tension is related to adolescence or to the loneliness people feel.
Right.
What do you think?
I think I was not thinking really specifically about what the pain, what specific pain I was thinking of, because I think it's more. So I think there are all different kinds of pain, you know, and just comfort and unease and actually it's interesting because part of the reason why I selected that title was when I was a teenager, I read this book called Ordinary People, and it's about a boy who's 18 years old or something, and his brother dies, and he gets very depressed and tries to kill himself, and his parents, it was made into a movie with Mary Tyler Moore, Robert Redford directed it, and it's a very beautiful book about a boy becoming very depressed and then and actually trying to kill himself and then getting better. And but I loved the book. I was very moved by the book. What? It's called Ordinary People, and Judith Guest.
Acá gente como that was the title instead.
Okay. But I wrote her a note saying how much I liked her book, and she wrote me back this really nice letter. Because I guess in my note I said that I was really depressed, and you know, and she wrote me back this very nice, very thoughtful letter saying, I understand why you'd be depressed. But she said something that was so beautiful. She said, you know, as an adult, I get depressed too, but I know, I have this experience that I know that I'm going to feel different, that I won't always feel this way, that in a couple days things will be different and something will happen that will change my mood and I'll feel better. And she said the hard thing about being an adolescent is you don't have that perspective, and feel very much that how you feel, you'll always feel that way. And of course somebody can tell you that, and you can understand it in a theoretical way, but nevertheless it doesn't really help you because you still feel what you feel. But I was very moved by both her generosity in writing to me and trying to explain that. And so it was sort of this concept that came back to me because I felt like it was saying the same thing in a way, that this might be painful, but in some way if you can get through it, it might not be such a bad thing, that it will make you who you are. And I sort of feel like, you know, if you get to a point in your life where you like yourself and feel good about yourself, then you have to look back and say, well, I am who I am because of all the things that have happened to me, and some of them were good and some were bad, so I feel like you have to then think, well, those bad things that happened to me, I'm glad they happened because they've made me who I am, you know, and if those bad things hadn't have happened, I might not be as thoughtful a person, or as sensitive a person, or as caring a person, you know, but again, it's like, it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to sort of live with the knowledge of that, or to understand it.
And then there's this other motto, or slogan, I don't know, no pain, no gain.
Gain, right, yes, yeah.
You see that at the gym.
Yeah, of course, right, yeah. I think that's something about physical pain. Yeah. But it's the same principle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if whether the actors have read the novel, and if you have discussed it, they have discussed it with you.
Right.
And
I don't know. I don't know. You know, I think some actors choose, they want to read the novel because I think they feel like it will help them understand more about the character. And I think other actors feel like they don't, that they just want to take the script and sort of form the character, their character. In the case of this book and this film, I didn't have anything to do with it while they were filming. Another book of mine was made into a movie, and actually it was filmed here in Argentina, and I did come down while they were filming and talk to the actors, and was part of that experience of making the film. And it was interesting. Some actors wanted to talk to me and discuss, you know, what they thought about the character, and others didn't, and it was, you know, I totally respected both of those. I think actors go about it in different ways, you know, in terms of creating their character.
did any of them like cheated on the director and acted as what your thought or what you have wrote? Like you said that the script was different from what you thought.
Right.
So did anyone separate from the script and did what you thought?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of in that case, but I know in other cases, actors have suggested to the director, they have read the book, and there's something in the book that they liked or that they thought helped define the character. And so they've asked the director, could we maybe include this, whether it's something that the character does or says or something. But I guess that's the part of making a movie that I feel like that's really up to the director, and as a writer, I'm not creating the film, and so I shouldn't really be involved with that because it's not my job anymore.
I have another question.
Sure.
What about the sexuality of the character, James? Because I really didn't come to know if he was like kind of repressed by society,
Right.
and he was just feeling in this ambiguous way because of that, or maybe it was just the way he felt it. He wasn't very active about it, and he just not way, not very defined maybe, or maybe yes, but not
Maybe not.
not very expressive about it, or maybe out.
I guess it's a hard question for me to answer because I feel like I'm very careful about what I put in the book and what I have James say and what happens to him. And so I feel like reading, it's a very collaborative, very creative thing. And so you read the book and you might have conclusions or thoughts about James that are different from mine. And I feel like yours are just as legitimate, that I don't have the right answers to those questions because your answers, I think if you've read the book and thought about it, they're just as legitimate as what I feel. And I guess I feel like my job is to put enough in the book so that you can form your own conclusions about where he is in that process or what it is that he's feeling. And it's always a tricky thing because I feel like I want to reveal enough about him so that he seems real and complex, but I don't want to over-explain him or to sort of tell you as a reader what to think about him. And I think everything you said is right, that it's a combination of all those things, that it's a combination of him maybe being a bit unsure about his sexuality, but also a combination, that combined with society. I think even now in New York City, he goes to the most progressive school and he has very progressive parents, but nevertheless there's this really, homophobic thing that just permeates society and discreetly or not so discreetly keeps telling people that they shouldn't be gay, that it's not the easy way or not the accepted way. And so I think it's very hard to, I think it's hard enough growing up straight to sort of embrace your sexuality and accept it and sort of understand it, and I think it's just more difficult when you're unsure about your sexuality because society doesn't help you in that case. It doesn't reinforce what it is you're feeling and thinking.
When I read it, I thought that he wasn't worried about fitting in or worried about his sexuality because he wouldn't be the stereotype of the straight teenager.
Right.
I thought that he just didn't want his sexuality to define who he was. And in one moment he says that being gay in New York and his like social class,
Right.
was in and was like a cool thing.
Forces us to define ourselves by our gender, first of all, and then by our sexuality. And when I feel like those are certainly things that contribute to our identity, but there are lots of things that make us who we are, and I don't know, it's always interesting to me that I don't understand why there's such importance is put on those things, like that those are how we're asked or how other people identify us.
And that is like the fight he has with his mom and his father that
Right.
wants him to tell them that
Right,
you're
yeah.
gay, you're
Okay.
not, and it's like it doesn't matter, and
Right.
then his grandmother talks him about love and how she sees him being in love.
Right,
It doesn't
right.
matter if he's gay or straight.
Right, exactly, right. So, yeah. No, and I think that's exactly right, that she has transcended that distinction. For her, it's not about whether he's gay or straight, it's whether, what he's feeling, is he feeling love, and that's the important thing.
Anything else?
We were talking about this thing called society on your novel, and we came to an argument within each other.
Uh-huh.
And some of us thought that sexuality nowadays is more banal, I don't know if you say,
Pain.
like
Banal.
banal
Right,
before,
uh-huh.
and some thought that we listened how New Zealand put this thing today connected to you
Right,
and social networks and privacy,
uh-huh.
And how it's recognized
mercantilized.
Right, uh-huh.
in a way like the media
Mhm.
transform into something that can be consumed.
Right,
So we started thinking about that.
yeah. Well, it's sort of really amazing to me that because of course, when I was writing this book, I was thinking a lot, and going back to those stories that you read, I thought a lot about my experience of being a teenager, being in high school, and how, when I was in high school, nobody was gay, or nobody was out, and that included both students and teachers, or in the world I lived in, there were no gay people or no people, and on TV, there were no gay people, and it was just sort of, and the idea, if you had told me then when I was 18 years old that in my lifetime that gay people could get married to each other, I would have not believed that. It was like impossible to conceive of a world in which, and so it's sort of amazing to me that in 30 years or whatever, that the world has changed so much, and that, there are TV shows now with gay characters on them, and so that's sort of amazing to me, but at the same time, it's really amazing still so homophobic, and especially, you know, in the United States, I still feel it's there. But then you know, there's all these other cultures where people are killed because of their sexuality, and so it's so, I don't know. It's both. I feel like we've come very far and made a lot of progress, but I feel like it's also still so disturbing to me that that people are still so jeopardized and endangered by their sexuality, or by their gender, or their religion, and all these things that it's just so unfortunate that people use these parts of identity to discriminate against people.
We talked about some kind of like hypocrisy as regards being on the outside, like some kind of progressive, but maybe on your inner values still kind of being like
Right.
conservative.
Right. Yeah.
You come at a crossroads, they say. Either you submit to the rules of the system, or
Right.
you're out.
Right.
You have to be so brave.
And that's why I feel, I mean, that's why one of the things I love about books and reading is that I feel like the only way people change is by experiencing, either through reading or seeing movies or whatever, lives that are different from their own. And I think once you experience a life that's different from your own and realize that that life doesn't threaten your own, you know, it's not, if gay people get married, it doesn't take anything, you know. But people are so afraid, I think, of their lives being threatened by people who are different from them. And I just feel like literature is very important in that way, because it's one way for people to start to understand and feel compassionate about people who are different from them. And that's why things like censorship is really troubling to me, because when people start not being able to write books, or not being able to publish books, or not being able to read books, it sort of interrupts that process of us understanding one another.
Nobody asked anything about the stories, about the two stories, Memorial Day and Jump for Life. And I think that we were surprised by the ending of the Memorial Day, you remember? The mother telling him.
Right.
Yeah. Sure. Ah.
Indeed, we go to send each of the most specifically the country in the right.
Well, it's a place to build stories too.
Yes,
Right.
maybe.
No,
because when I read the novel, I got a lot of characters, and specifically in that book, so I wanted to ask you if that.
yeah, when I was writing this book, I started writing it, and I wasn't thinking about Salinger, and then suddenly I became very aware of that. And I realized that it's impossible to write a book with a young male adolescent narrator and set it in New York City and not have those connotations of Salinger, just because that book is so amazing, and it's a book that casts a very big shadow over all other books sort of about adolescence. And you know, and I realized that, and my immediate response was to stop writing this book, that I was doing something that had already been done, and that there was no need for another book about, you know, a disenchanted, unhappy boy in New York City. But then I realized, you know, I could say that about every book that I wrote, that there are other books out there that are similar, and I feel like this idea that you're creating something new is totally bogus, that you're really not, that, and so I just had to stop thinking about that and say, I'm gonna write a book about this character, James, and I'm gonna concentrate on what makes him unique, and, you know, and I felt like, well, it was New York City, but I feel like New York City is always changing, and it was very different New York City, and so, but it was interesting because I found out, just going back to the film of this book, was the reason Roberto Faenza, the Italian director, wanted to make this was because he always wanted to make a movie of The Catcher in the Rye. Of course, Salinger refused to sell the movie rights to that book. He said it could never be a movie. So I think Roberto Faenza felt this was, if he couldn't make that, so this was the next best thing that he could come. It was as close as he could come. Yeah.
But I think that if you write something and it's always shadow of the previous things that have been written and
Right,
things
right.
that we have read. It's like, it's important to write something absolutely new.
Right. No, and I realized the most recent book I published was a book, and it's set in England in the 1950s. So of course I lived in England a little bit when I was growing up, but it was in the 1970s. So I was writing about a place I had never been, in a time that I had never experienced, and I realized as I was writing that book that the reason why that book was set in that place and at that time was because I love reading books by British women writers from Virginia Woolf through the 1940s and 50s that are all set sort of in England during the 40s and 50s. And I've read so many of those books during my life that when I came to that point to write a book, I was drawing not so much from my experiences of being alive, but from my experiences of reading. And that's going back to sort of how important reading is, because I realized that what I've read is important to me in my life, sort of as what I've actually experienced. And in some ways more important, because I feel like what you read can affect you in stronger and deeper and more permanent ways than things you experience. And especially I think a lot that what you read when you're younger, you respond to in a stronger way. I think as a reader you sort of become jaded, and as you read more, I think books have less of an effect on you. But I still think, I mean, when I think about the books that I really connected with, it's going back to like Ordinary People by Judith Getz. That book I read when I was like 17 years old really affected me in a way that rarely has happened, since then. And those are the books that sort of stay in my subconscious that then inform what I write. I'm curious if you felt there was a difference between the stories and the novel. Did they feel, I mean, going back to like the question about the Age of Innocence being the time gap between when it was written and when it was published, and sort of this, did the stories and this novel seem to be taking place at the same time in the same world, or did they feel different?
I think James has much more cynical view of the world. And I think it's much more connected with the age he's living in.
Yeah, that's true. When you just think about, I mean, it's so interesting with the internet, where so much more information and experiences are available to people now than just 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Yeah, their scope of how you experience the world is so different.
Yeah, the innocence of the two characters in the true story.
Right.
Yeah, more exposed. I also thought about this gap between the character you write and your book, because as I was thinking about I thought it couldn't be possible now. Like, you can't just disappear and be
Right.
And I thought about it, and I thought, how is it gonna resolve it? How is it gonna, how are you gonna do this thing of getting away and being apart? Well, you have a part in your book, in your second book,
Right.
it just goes away. But I think that is the most radical experience you can have, because it's just a few days in which you are not connected, but it's looking for you. And I mean, it's
Right. No, and it gets harder and harder to disconnect, because we're all connected to each other in so many ways now. Yeah.
I think your book maybe has these things because maybe some books weren't as usual as in this time, and maybe you are looking back. It's not as today, but it has this changing thing that makes you say it's another time we are living, and also it has the same characteristics of the catching the right time.
Right.
And now you can do that novel because you will always be harassed by that, the excess of communication we have nowadays.
Right.
I was thinking again of the stories of the material I have read. Well, I'm not going to insist on the other question, but I was thinking of the character in Memorial Day who started writing letters to people in prisons, for example. Have you ever done something of the sort?
No, I haven't done that. So, but I guess it's again sort of a way of trying to define that character, somebody who does want to communicate, but is unable to communicate with those people immediately around him, so he reaches out to these strangers, and actually people who are in prison, so they're sort of forced to respond, or not. But I guess, yeah, I think a lot of my work is about communication and how people communicate or miscommunicate or fail to communicate, and sort of, that sort of, yeah, like what does it mean to write a letter to somebody you've never, to try and form a correspondence with
Yeah, but
somebody
he
you've never
shows
met.
people in a kind of similar
Right,
situation
yes, right,
to what he
yes,
was
yeah.
going through.
Right. And then, I mean, and I think as you mentioned, the end of Memorial Day, it's about communication, about wanting communication, but then being afraid of the message, or, so the mother wants him to talk, but then
That's what we
suddenly,
thought.
yeah, but then she's not sure she actually wants to hear what he has to say, so, yeah.
I think that there are some similarities between the characters in Memorial Day and this Useful. I mean, there are some coincidences between James and the boy, this failure to communicate,
Right.
this kind of, I don't know, the relationship with his mother, the thing about the perspective that he has about her new husband in one
That's right.
story, and
Right,
this
right.
new husband and his brother in some way.
Yeah.
I think in the novel there's also a mention of connecting with strangers and how that doesn't affect him if he can speak with strangers very naturally.
Right.
And how he can talk to situations that he can't talk to his mother.
Right, right.
Do you like working with those things that are against traditional American society? I mean, your parents' characters are split, divorced,
Right.
and I can see a change that he's always against. How I can see it, against the society.
What is politically correct?
What is political?
What is,
Yeah, and his idea of not going to college and just
Right,
trying to
right, yeah, it's
have
true.
to
Right, right,
free.
right. I guess it's interesting to me because people kept asking me, especially when I was writing short stories and publishing a lot of short stories, and often the parents in the short stories would be divorced, and my parents were not divorced, and they were saying, why are you always writing about these people who are divorced? Like, what's that about? And it occurred to me that, and it's the same with characters, where I feel like people who are happy and are content in their lives don't make very interesting characters, because if you're happy, there's really no story there. You don't want to change. If you're happy, you like your life, and you don't want to change. And I feel like stories are about people who are not happy and want something other than what they have. And so I think those are the characters that seem interesting to me and that I'm drawn to. But, like it really bothered my parents, because everybody assumed I came, that my parents were divorced and they assume all these things about me based on what I've written. But I think you make these choices because you want your characters to be searching for something and to be in that process of changing. Because for me, books are always about, there's actually a quote from Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein, that I used as an epigram for one of my collections of short stories. And the quote is something like, I shall now tell you about events that affected me with feelings that have changed me from who I was into who I am. And I love that quote because to me it was like a definition of what a short story or a novel is. It's like, I was this person at the beginning, and then these things happened to me, and I felt these things, and now I'm a different person. And I think there are different kinds of books, because I think there are some books where that happens and the character is aware that they've changed, the character, and that's, the character has an epiphany and suddenly realizes that something has changed. And then I think there are other books where the character changes, but they don't realize that the reader realizes that the character has changed. The character doesn't quite realize that yet, and it's a more subtle change that only in retrospect sort of will the character realize that. Because I think often we're not aware we're changing while we're changing. it's only in retrospect when you look back and say, oh, I was a very different person, or I thought different things then.
I found that the end pretty similar to the Catcher in the Rye, where the guy says, well, I'm now in the system, I'm going to college, I'm trying to take up school now,
Right.
and I saw it pretty similar as the way you were expressing you before. I mean, that epiphany really concludes in the
Right.
ending of you are up to make that changes. I saw that maybe the ending in these books are not as great as the parts where they tell the stories. Maybe in the Catcher in the Rye, I really remember the part where it refers to the title, and also in where he looks back. Well, he realizes that the way he's living now, where he's in his grandmother's house, and he says that I'm pretty fine here. I love the way I live here. I don't want to change things the way I.
Did you say this book? When I finished this book, it ended with the chapter, the second to last chapter. It ended with him, the roommate, calling him and him picking up the phone and saying hello. And for me, that's where the book ended, and I wanted to end it there. And then people read the book and they said that's not a good ending. Like it's too. We need one more chapter. And I was sort of torn because I sort of felt like just by the act of him picking up the phone and saying hello, I felt like that was this investment he was making in his future that for me was enough. But for a lot of people, they felt like it wasn't enough, it was too inconclusive. And so I wrote this next chapter where I felt, so you do learn he goes to college, even though you're not sure what happened. But I'm still unsure about that. It's very tricky to know where the right place is to end a book.
But that gets you very tense about what the ending is really.
Right. Yeah.
I think the book ends with
Right. Oh, good. Yeah.
I think making the character says, well, I'm going to follow in my life, and the other part of the story is not what it concerns this book, and I like that kind of endings. I mean, it's pretty generic, but I saw it in books, and you say, well, this book has to end in some way.
Right. Yeah.
And I like it. It's really very repetitive. But
Everything ends. So, thinking of that, so perhaps we are going to start rounding off, right? So, come on.
This thing about knowing about what you're going to do in your life might change. Do you see this in teenagers from the States?
Not sure what I understand.
This thing about
This thing, I mean, nowadays, like,
claro, sí.
you're in the days that
A veces de Estados Unidos lo ve eso, debe saber qué hacer con
If you see that in the States, you live teenagers, don't know what to do.
No, I mean, I don't think that way at all. I think when I write a book, I'm writing about one character, and that's all I'm writing about. And it's fine for people to draw conclusions about if James is symbolic of, and it's interesting, when the book was published in Italy or in other countries, people said, oh, like he's a typical American teenager, and it's like, that you can say that, but for me, he's not typical. He's a very individual person, and that's all. I'm just concerned with him as being individual and not being representative of anything other than who he is.
Typical, not typical.
Exactly.
You share this opinion that Rainer Maria has about college and about the experience of college nowadays in the States.
Oh, good.
We know that you have
Yeah, we know that you teach in college, but I don't know what your opinion is.
No, I don't. I mean, I think, I have my characters say things, and some of them I agree with some of them. But I also think there's an element of truth in what he says, certainly. But I feel like all experiences, going to college, it's very complex, and there's some worthwhile aspects of it, and some that are sort of nonsensical, that aren't very valuable. So, but that's life, like this.
So we could go on forever, but I think
Okay.
Yes.
Like,